The Carja are a tribe of sun worshippers that have built up an impressive civilization over the past few centuries. They are generally recognizable by their colorful silks, incorporation of precious metals and decorative machine parts into their attire, and common use of eye makeup. Carja soldiers, in particular, commonly wear red-plumed helmets. How elaborate these displays will be will vary based on social class. A merchant will dress more lavishly than a noble, and a laborer will likely wear simple clothes. The Carja are a very large tribe. Starting from the founding of the city of Meridian atop the mesa, the Carja Sundom expanded its territory until it met the borders of the Norse sacred lands in the east and the great canyons of the Daunt, beyond which lies what the Carja call the Forbidden West. To their north lies the borderlands of the Oseram tribe's territory, called the Claim. To the south, the Carja control the fertile lands of the Jewel. All of these lands are dotted with stone fortifications, settlements, and grand estates of the Carja, who easily outclass their neighbors in architectural achievement. This is built on a prosperous agrarian culture made possible by their proximity to the Jewel, as well as a general openness to trade with willing neighbors, especially the Oseram. Despite that, it is perhaps unsurprising that the Carja have a tendency to look down on other tribes, with apparently less impressive achievements. The Carja have a hierarchical culture topped by a theocratic absolute monarchy. They worship the sun as a deity, whose light is the source of all life. Sun and shadow form two halves of nature. The Carja believe a demon called the Buried Shadow destroyed the world of the Old Ones before the Carja, and would again destroy the Carja as well one day. But as the sun rises after night, so too would life return after the Carja are gone. The ruler of the Carja is the Sun King, chosen of the sun and divine representative responsible for interpreting its will. The Sun King is always a man. There have been no ruling Sun Queens. All Sun Kings are of the Radiant line, descended from the first Sun King, though succession does not always follow birth order. Sometimes younger sons have become Sun King instead of their brothers. He is served by the Sun Priests, who are also exclusively male. Then come various nobles, artisans, and laborers. Historically, the Carja have used slave labor, but the practice was outlawed by the 14th Sun King Avad. They have also maintained a large army. At some points in their history, every capable man was obliged to join the army. Soldiers guard all Carja outposts and settlements, but the hunting of the most dangerous machines is usually left to the Hunter's Lodge in exchange for a boon. The 10th Sun King Nehasis, an avid hunter himself, arranged a hunting competition between men of Carja noble houses. Those who brought down the most impressive machines he named the Sunhawk and Hawks. By tradition, there can only be 7 hawks at one time. Only one of them can be the Sunhawk, the most accomplished hunter and leader of the lodge. Each hawk sponsors an apprentice of sorts called a thrush, who will become a hawk when their sponsor dies. So there are only ever 14 members of the Hunter's Lodge at one time, 7 senior and 7 junior. However, other hunters called fledglings are allowed to use the lodge's facilities if they perform well in the hunting grounds managed by the lodge. The hunting grounds provide machine hunting challenges where the hunter may be awarded badges for their performance, either a half-sun, full sun, or a blazing sun. Until recently, only Carja men of noble houses were allowed to join the lodge, but by the decree of Sun King Avad, the lodge has been forced to open its doors to common Carja, women, and even outlanders. Due to their early mastery of written language from the ruins of the Old Ones, the history of the Carja is easier to track than most tribes. Traditionally, they record dates by the years of the current Sun King's reign. The Carja trace their origins to what they call the Savage East, Nora lands, suggesting their ancestors were Nora or some proto-group that spawned both tribes. Their founder was named Ahriman, who went into the ruins of the Old World and discovered what the Carja call the Leaves of the Old Ones, which taught him about observing the sun, its movement, and supposed worship. When he attempted to share his knowledge with his tribe, they were afraid or envious. Ahriman and his followers were forced into exile to the west. The journey was harsh and many died, including Ahriman's family. This period of wandering tribulation was years long and is subject to much mythologizing in Carja scripture. Ultimately, Ahriman followed a glint hawk that alighted atop a great spire whose shadow fell across a mesa in a nearby valley. Taking this as a sign, Ahriman and his followers built their settlement, called Meridian after a passage from the Leaves of the Old Ones, atop that mesa, and the site of the spire became a holy place called the Alight, which would become the burial place of Carja kings. Ahriman was declared the first Sun King of the Carja. The second Sun King, the bounteous Amavad, oversaw the sowing of the royal maizelands and the development of the Carja as an agricultural people. The third Sun King, the far-seeing Sadahin, expanded the domain of the Carja, including establishing a harbor at Bright Market on the lake they called Daybrink. He was the first to call the Carja's lands the Sundom, as they are known to this day. The fourth Sun King, generous Juadan, stocked the metal stores of the Carja from his own hunts and increased trade with other tribes. To facilitate this, he shared Carja knowledge of glyphs, written language. The fifth Sun King, Zavarad the Pilgrim, expanded the Sundom north, building the harbor of Blazon Arch on the other side of the Daybrink to celebrate his success. The sixth Sun King, Bold Iriv, saw the passing of the sun into the west as a challenge to cross the canyons the Carja called the Daunt. After 3 unsuccessful attempts, Iriv and his men found a way through, but were never heard from again. The seventh Sun King, Prudent Basadid, was Iriv's brother. To discourage others from following in his brother's footsteps and sharing his fate, Basadid declared the lands beyond the Daunt the Forbidden West, where only the sun may go. He created a garrison at Blazon Arch and built the fortress of Sunfall to mark the westward border of the Sundom. The eighth Sun King, Kuvadin the Returner, was the last to try and expand the Sundom, this time to spread civilization to the savage east, back where the Carja originally came from. His efforts to incorporate the sacred lands of the Nora ultimately failed, and he declared that those lands were no longer fit for the people of the sun. The Fort of Daytower was constructed to mark the border between their lands. The ninth Sun King, Renan the Firebird, saw the first large-scale incursion of the Sundom by another tribe. A horde of Tenakth, a tribe from the south and west, invaded the Carja lands. Against the advice of his advisors, Renan led his soldiers into battle personally. He led them to victory over the Tenakth, but was so badly disfigured that he wore his helmet at all times for the rest of his life. The 10th Sun King, Nehasis, was a skilled hunter of machines and, as mentioned, established the Hunter's Lodge in Meridian that persists to this day. The 11th Sun King, the illuminated Marzid, was said to receive grand and vivid visions. He commissioned statues and frescoes of his visage in Meridian. He expanded the fortress at Sunfall into a palace, and spent his days there painting among the artisans and nobles he had gathered to himself. The great stone ring that had previously been used for training soldiers of the garrison was repurposed for displays of pageantry. Sunfall became a city unto itself, dedicated to the arts. Such was the glory days of Sunfall before Marzid succumbed to the poisonous fumes of his own pigments, to be succeeded by his elder brother. The 12th Sun King, Hevus, sought to rejuvenate the weakened Carja military. He ordered every capable Carja male to join the military and for craftspeople to focus on creating weapons and armor. He also introduced slavery to the Carja way of life. He would be followed by his son, the 11th Sun King Jiren, and thus began a period of great pain for the Carja and their neighbors. In the early years of his reign, Jiren used his father's military to fend off encroachment from other tribes, and was popular amongst his people. With his success came a growing megalomania, however. An early sign, he ordered elite soldiers to train in the heavy sandstorms of Sandwhisper Valley. The survivors of this brutal regimen formed the Kestrels, an elite guard fanatically loyal not to the Sundom, not to the monarchy, but to Jiren personally. The greatest among his Kestrels, Helis, became their commander, the Sun King's chosen of the Sun. His enemies among the Carja would call him the Terror of the Sun, for his brutality as an enforcer and fanatical devotion. Among the Asuram, they called him the Stacker of Corpses. Harsh punishments and violence became common in the Sun King's court, for Jiren's generosity to his loyalists was exceeded only by his cruelty for even the slightest whisper of disloyalty. Fueling his madness was an ongoing crisis that began in the 15th year of his reign, the derangement of the machines. The machines had once been fairly placid, becoming violent only in response to attack and most simply fleeing. That all changed. Machines became more aggressive and started appearing more heavily armed. New combat-focused machines began to appear more deadly than ever. The world outside cities and settlements became deadlier every year. Jiren began to believe that something was deeply wrong with the world, and the solution was to shed blood for the sun. In the Sun Ring in Meridian and Sunfall, human sacrifices were performed to appease the sun. Slaves would be laid out to be killed by captured machines, overseen by the High Priest if not the Mad Sun King himself. When his own Kestrels were accidentally killed by such machines, Jiren declared that the sun would take sacrifices of the faithful and the faithless both. To increase the scale and secure their supply of sacrifices, Jiren ordered the military to begin a campaign of terror against neighboring tribes, remembered as the Red Raids. Captives were taken from the Nora, Asuram, Banuk, and the distant Utaru. Carja forces even ventured into the Forbidden West to raid the Tenakth. For 10 years the raids continued, and blood flowed in the Sun Ring. Not even the nobles of the Carja were safe. Honored hunters of the Hunter's Lodge protested Jiren's depravity and despotism, and for their trouble were thrown into the Sun Ring as well. During their execution, some of their fellow Hawks of the Lodge smuggled in weapons and jumped into the ring to fight alongside them, but all were massacred in the end. The Sun King's own eldest son, Kataman, also raised his voice in protest. Even he was not spared the Sun Ring. After his brother's death, Jiren's middle son Avad realized the madness would only end after his father's death, and fled Meridian with his personal guard. Avad had befriended a slave named Ursa, an Asuram woman that had been made to serve in the palace after surviving the Sun Ring. He had helped her escape and now reunited with her in the claim. Avad and Ursa forged alliances with several Asuram warlords and freebooters that had resisted the raids to gather an army to challenge his father. As they marched on Meridian, the Carja's first civil war officially began. The faith of the Carja dictated the absolute righteousness of the Sun King's actions as representative of the sun's will, but their faith had been shaken by Jiren's cruelty, and Avad's status as a legitimate heir to the Sundom allowed many soldiers to justify defecting to his side. By the time they arrived at the city, only the Sun King's most die-hard supporters and his Kestrels remained. Avad's forces executed a three-pronged attack, one group scaling the cliffside of Meridian beneath the Temple of the Sun, another crossing the aqueduct to the palace, while Oseram cannons broke down the city gates and felled defenders on the outer walls. Further, during the battle, the slave captives were released from the cells beneath the Sun Ring. Many of Jiren's loyalists took the opportunity to slip in with the chaotic mob and abandon the city. Avad confronted his father in the palace. Knowing that the mad Sun King would not answer for his crimes honorably, he struck down his father, at least according to the stories. The Sun Priests would say that the Sun would never allow the murder of a true Sun King, so Jiren's death proved his illegitimacy. Avad the Liberator soon took his place as the 14th Sun King, but this was not the end of the war. Before his death, Jiren had ordered his champion Helis to take his wife and youngest son Itamen from the city. He carved a bloody swath through friend and foe alike to accomplish his orders. He took them to Sunfall, where the high priest Bahavis installed Itamen as the new Sun King of the Carja in Shadow, or Shadow Carja, representing their disgraceful exile from Holy Meridian. Itamen was, of course, a puppet to Bahavis, and Helis spiraled down a still darker path. The Shadow Carja and Avad's Sun Carja would clash, but ultimately reach a stalemate that lasted 2 years. In the meantime, Avad did his best to right his father's wrongs. He abolished slavery from the Sundom and forbade all further sacrifices. The Sun Ring in Meridian became a place of memorial for his father's victims. The cruel punishments employed by his father and even previous Sun Kings were abolished or reduced in favor of mercy and reform. Instead of executions, many of the worst would be imprisoned at Sunstone Rock, a prison constructed at the southern edge of the Jewel. He even questioned some of the Carja's long-held traditions, likely influenced by Ursa, whose Oseram freebooters formed the core of the Vanguard, his new personal guard. The city of Meridian, which had previously been closed to non-Carja, opened its gates for all. He also decreed that the Hunter's Lodge would be open to women, commoners, and even outlanders to join. Perhaps more importantly, he sought to repair relations with the other tribes. In particular, despite a fraught history of invasion and many Carja viewing them as savages, the High Matriarchs of the Norja have been receptive to Avad's efforts to make peace, though many Nora still resent the Carja for their crimes. The Banuk Weraks living in the Cut, the southernmost region of Banuk territory, had been hit hard by the raids. The greater Banuk Weraks in their heartland were willing to make peace, but others were more reluctant. The Cut being a favored hunting ground for some Carja nobles, several Carja have gone missing every season for the past few years. At least some of them were killed by Banuk, who still carry hatred for the Carja. Broadly, the Oseram have supported Avad's new regime. Historically, a close relationship between the tribes led to Oseram work crews helping to engineer the great lifts in Meridian that move people and goods to and from the valley floor. Many Oseram have immigrated into the Sundom seeking work since Avad ascended to the throne. However, some who lost loved ones to the Red Raids hate all of the Carja, not just the Shadow Carja. One warlord attempted to bring down Meridian with explosives and assassinate Avad. Ultimately, the conflict with the Shadow Carja would come to an end with help from a Nora outlander named Aloy. The High Priest Bahavis was killed while out of Sunfall. The Queen and Itamen were smuggled back to the Sun Carja. Avad welcomed his half-brother and gave him refuge. As for the last leader of the Shadow Carja, Helis had formed a fanatical cult within the Shadow Carja called Eclipse, in alliance with an intelligence called Hades that presented itself as the buried shadow of Carja mythology. Under Hades' influence, Helis led a last desperate attack on Meridian using ancient war machines, only to be killed by Aloy. Eclipse and the ancient machines were defeated by Aloy's allies and the Sun Carja. It suffices to say that the Carja are still healing from a traumatic era of their history, but the reign of Sun King Avad holds much promise, and the most immediate dangers to the safety and stability of the Sundom are no more. Okay, that'll probably be the longest of these tribal videos. The Carja have a lot of content. Even though Aloy is of the Nora, Horizon Zero Dawn is actually much more focused on this civil war situation with the Carja than the Nora once you get out of the Sacred Lands. I actually think they were the first ones that the developers actually conceived of and created. Anyway, one thing that confused me when I was doing research for this was the Sun Ring. I thought it was this big arena in Sunfall, but it's actually a generic term apparently. Both this arena and this open area in Meridian are both called the Sun Ring. Both are places where people are sacrificed. Anyway, that's all for now. I have more lore content on my channel if you're interested, and I hope you all have a nice day.